Think about the foundational myth of the American dream, the one we are all taught from a very young age. We picture independent pioneers taming a wild frontier, rugged farmers charting their own destiny, and skilled tradesmen working under their own names in bustling colonial towns. We imagine a landscape of boundless opportunity where hard work directly equaled personal prosperity, a place where a person's labor was respected and inherently valuable. But beneath that romanticized veneer lies a deeply unsettling reality that governed this country for over a century and a half. From the moment the ink dried on the Declaration of Independence until the waning days of the Great Depression in 1938, there was absolutely no federal law requiring an employer to pay a worker anything at all. No minimum wage, no overtime, no weekend, no mandated breaks, and certainly no safety net beneath your feet. You could labor until your bones ached and your lungs bled, operating deafening machinery for 16 continuous hours, and your employer was legally entitled to hand you practically nothing in return. There was no agency to call, no hotline to dial, and no legal precedent to cite. You were entirely at the mercy of the man who owned the factory, the mine, or the mill. The richest, most rapidly expanding nation on the face of the earth was built upon a terrifying legal void, a silent agreement among the powerful that human labor was merely a raw material to be extracted at the absolute lowest conceivable price. To understand how millions of people eventually found themselves trapped in this brutal system, we have to look at what life actually looked like before the industrial machine swallowed the country whole. In the early 1800s, the vast majority of Americans did not work for wages at all. They were subsistence farmers living on small, scattered plots of land across the eastern seaboard and pushing slowly into the frontier. Money, in the form of physical cash, was remarkably scarce in rural communities. Entire towns operated almost entirely on intricate barter systems. You might trade a dozen eggs for a sack of flour, or offer a week of physical labor in a neighbor's field in exchange for help raising your own barn before the winter frost set in. Cash was something a typical family might see only a few times a year, perhaps when selling a small surplus of crops at a distant market town. The modern concept of an hourly wage, of clocking in at dawn and clocking out at dusk, of waiting anxiously for a paper paycheck on Friday afternoon, simply did not exist for the overwhelming majority of the population. Life was undeniably difficult and incredibly fragile, but it possessed a specific kind of autonomy. You answered to the seasons, to the soil, and to your community, but you rarely answered to a corporate overseer. For the small fraction of early Americans who did work for wages, the arrangement was intensely intimate and deeply personal. The economy was driven by the master and apprentice model. A young man would move into the home of an established craftsman, a blacksmith, a carpenter, or a printer, and live under his roof for 5 to 7 years. In exchange for his daily labor, the apprentice received room, board, and the transfer of specialized knowledge. When the apprenticeship finally concluded, that young man became a journeyman, stepping out into the world with a recognized, highly valued skill. He could sit across a table from a potential employer, look him directly in the eye, and negotiate his worth face to face. It was an informal, entirely unregulated system, but it functioned effectively because the scale of commerce was incredibly small. A skilled carpenter in Boston might negotiate a decent living, while a cobbler in a small Virginia village might barely scrape by. Yet both men maintained a degree of leverage. They possessed skills that could not be easily replicated. Their labor was not anonymous. They were human beings engaged in a direct mutual transaction with other human beings within their own communities. But this fragile ecosystem of independent farmers and skilled artisans was living on borrowed time. The turning point arrived with the slow, rumbling onset of the Industrial Revolution, beginning quietly in the 1820s and accelerating into an unstoppable force in the chaotic decades immediately following the Civil War. The American economy began to undergo one of the most violent and dramatic transformations in human history. Factories began to rise like dark monuments across the Northeast, towering structures of brick and iron powered first by the rushing currents of rivers and eventually by the relentless burning energy of steam. Textile mills devoured the landscapes of New England, massive ironworks darkened the skies over Pennsylvania, and sprawling meatpacking plants transformed Chicago into a terrifying hub of mechanized slaughter. These enormous operations required something the old craft economy had never needed and could barely even comprehend. They required a staggering, seemingly infinite supply of unskilled workers who were desperate enough to perform the exact same agonizing repetitive task for 10, 12, or even 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. The intimate, face-to-face relationship between a master and an apprentice was systematically dismantled and replaced by something infinitely colder, darker, and more impersonal. It was replaced by the relationship between a faceless industrial corporation and a disposable unit of labor. In this new world, you were no longer a craftsman negotiating your worth. You were a biological gear designed to keep the steel machines running, and the fuel for this new industrial engine arrived in massive, unprecedented waves. Between 1840 and 1900, millions upon millions of immigrants from Ireland, Germany, Italy, Poland, Russia, and China poured into crowded American cities. They arrived carrying the trauma of famine, fleeing brutal political persecution and escaping devastating poverty in their homelands. They stepped off crowded ships into a country that desperately needed the strength of their hands and the sweat of their brows, but possessed absolutely no interest in protecting their lives or recognizing their humanity. The men who owned these towering new factories understood exactly what this influx of desperate humanity meant for their bottom line. When thousands of starving people are waiting outside your factory gates, begging for the opportunity to work, you do not need to negotiate. You dictate. And what they dictated was a system of exploitation so profound it borders on the unimaginable today. During the period historians politely call the Gilded Age, the average factory worker in America earned roughly 20 cents an hour. For a brutal 12-hour shift, a typical laborer might bring home somewhere between $6 and $10 for an entire week of grueling, bone-crushing work. Even adjusted for modern inflation, that is the equivalent of trying to survive, feed a family, and secure shelter on roughly $200 a week in a city where rents were constantly climbing and food prices fluctuated wildly. It did not take long for these workers to realize the devastating reality of their new existence. The promise of the American frontier, the dream of independent prosperity, had been swallowed whole by the roaring furnaces of industrial capitalism. They were trapped in a paradox of extreme proximity and extreme isolation, stripped of autonomy and completely vulnerable to the predatory mechanisms that were quietly being constructed around them, systems designed to exploit their labor and own their lives. If the meager wages of the Gilded Age factory floor were a slow, agonizing grind, what happened in the isolated corners of the country was an outright trap designed to make escape legally and financially impossible. As heavy industry expanded into the rugged, remote wilderness of the nation, corporate executives realized that simply underpaying their workforce was an incomplete strategy. To maximize profits and maintain absolute control, they needed a mechanism that would guarantee their workers could never leave, never save money, and never build leverage. The solution was the company town, a terrifyingly complete economic vacuum where a single corporation owned not just the workplace, but every physical structure, every square foot of land, and every resource necessary for human survival. In the coal-rich hollows of Appalachia, the timber camps of the Pacific Northwest, and the isolated mining hubs of the West, this feudal system flourished without a whisper of government interference. A mining conglomerate would acquire a vast tract of land, construct a coal shaft, and then build an entire town around it. They built the tiny wooden shacks the workers slept in, the local church where they prayed, the school their children attended, and the sole general store within a 50-mile radius. Everything was owned by the employer. And most critically, these corporations stopped paying their workers in actual United States currency altogether. Instead, they instituted the scrip system, handing out metal tokens, cardboard chips, or paper slips stamped with the company's name. Company scrip was a manufactured form of private tender that carried zero legal value outside the perimeter of the company's land. You could not take it to a bank in a neighboring town and exchange it for greenbacks. You could not use it to purchase a ticket on a departing train. You could not send it to relatives in another state. It was completely useless anywhere except at the single company-owned general store located down the dirt road from the mine head. The British Parliament had recognized the sheer cruelty of this setup over a century earlier, outlawing the practice under the Truck Act of 1831 because it reduced human beings to economic captives. But in America, a country that championed the absolute freedom of private contract, no such protection existed. The practice was entirely legal, remarkably widespread, and executed with cold precision. The company store was the engine of this perpetual poverty trap. Because workers had no real money and no physical means to reach independent merchants, the company store operated as a ruthless monopoly. Prices for basic necessities were routinely marked up by 30, 50, or even 100% compared to prices in open, competitive city markets. A pound of bacon, a bag of flour, or a pair of work boots that cost a fair price in a nearby city was priced at an exorbitant premium inside the company town. When a worker's weekly scrip earnings inevitably fell short of the cost required to feed his family, the company generously extended him credit. They charged high interest rates on that credit, deducting the balance directly from his next paycheck before he ever touched a single token. Within a matter of months, a miner would find himself trapped in a permanent cycle of debt. He was no longer working to earn a living. He was working off an ever-accumulating debt to the very man who owned his home and paid his wages. If a worker dared to complain about the inflated prices or the worthlessness of the scrip, he was immediately fired. Once fired, he was evicted from his company-owned home within hours, blacklisted from working at any other mine in the region, and often harassed or physically beaten by private armed security forces hired by the corporation to maintain order. The infamous line from the legendary folk song that a worker owed his soul to the company store was not a creative metaphor. It was a precise, literal description of the legal and financial reality for hundreds of thousands of American families. Yet, as dark as the scrip system was, the industrial machine required an even greater sacrifice to keep its gears turning at maximum speed. It demanded the labor of the most vulnerable members of society, the children. By the turn of the 20th century, census data revealed a staggering truth that exposed the rotten core of the nation's economic boom. Roughly 20% of all American children under the age of 15 were employed full-time in factories, mines, mills, and sweatshops. Some of these children were as young as 5 or 6 years old, working long, grueling shifts before they even learned how to write their own names. In the massive textile mills scattered across the American South and New England, children were highly prized assets not despite their size, but because of it. Their tiny, nimble fingers could reach deep into the spinning gears of massive, roaring looms to tie broken threads or clear jammed spindles while the machines were still running at full throttle. A single slip of a small hand meant a severed finger, a crushed wrist, or an arm yanked directly into the gears. In the dark, damp depths of the Pennsylvania coal mines, young boys worked as breaker boys. For 10 to 12 hours a day, they sat hunched over long wooden chutes, watching an endless river of jagged black rock slide beneath them. Their job was to pick out slate, bone, and impurities with their bare hands. The physical toll on these children was horrific and permanent. Years of breathing dense coal dust blackened their lungs before they reached puberty. Their fingers were perpetually cut, swollen, and infected from the sharp edges of the sliding rock, their knees deformed, and their spines permanently warped from hours spent bent over in dark, unventilated sheds. For this grueling, life-destroying work, a breaker boy might earn 40 to 70 cents a day, a tiny fraction of an adult's wage. But for a family living in a company town where a father made $6 a week and rent took half of it, that child's 70 cents was the thin, desperate line between having a crust of bread for dinner and starving in the dark. Employers knew this dynamic, intimate details and exploited it ruthlessly. Children were cheaper to pay, vastly easier to control, and completely incapable of organizing strikes or forming unions. In industries like glass manufacturing, where heat reached unbearable temperatures and flying shards of molten glass were a constant hazard, children made up nearly half of the entire workforce. An entire generation of working-class American children was systematically denied an education, robbed of their health, and stripped of their childhood, ground up inside an industrial machine that viewed them as nothing more than low-cost, easily replaceable fuel. They were born into debt, raised in dust, and bound to a system that treated human lives as the cheapest raw material on the market. By the early years of the 20th century, the sheer scale of unrestrained exploitation had transformed the American industrial landscape into a pressure cooker bound to explode. Across the nation, millions of workers were reaching a breaking point where the slow death of perpetual debt, child exploitation, and starvation wages felt indistinguishable from the immediate danger of standing up to fight. This was an era where the workplace was not merely unfair, it was routinely lethal. In 1882 alone, an average of 675 workers were killed in industrial accidents every single week in the United States. If you lost an arm in an unshielded power loom, if your legs were crushed in a mine cave-in, or if your lungs were destroyed by chemical fumes, there was no workers' compensation, no state disability support, and no legal obligation for your employer to offer a single dime of assistance. You were simply tossed onto the street and replaced by the next desperate soul waiting at the factory gates. Nothing illustrated this absolute disregard for human life more horrifyingly than the catastrophe that unfolded on the afternoon of March 25, 1911, in Lower Manhattan. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory occupied the top floors of the Ash Building, where hundreds of young immigrant women, mostly Italian and Jewish teenage girls, toiled for 13 hours a day sewing silk blouses. To prevent the workers from slipping away for unauthorized bathroom breaks or stealing scraps of fabric, the factory managers had routinely adopted a standard practice of the era, locking the exit doors from the outside. When a fire broke out in a scrap bin on the 8th floor, spreading with terrifying speed through piles of tissue paper and hanging fabric, the young women rushed to the exit doors, only to find them solidly bolted shut. The single exterior fire escape buckled under the weight of the terrified crowd and collapsed into the alley below. The fire department arrived swiftly, but their horse-drawn ladders reached only as high as the 6th floor. Trapped inside a roaring furnace, dozens of young women crammed themselves against the high window ledges. As horrified spectators gathered on the streets below, watching in stunned silence, women began jumping hand in hand from the 9th and 10th floors to escape the flames. In less than 40 minutes, 146 workers perished. Most of them were between the ages of 16 and 23. The pavement was littered with bodies, a grim and undeniable proof of what happens when a society permits unlimited corporate power to operate without a single safety law, minimum wage, or basic human standard. Yet the tragic sacrifice at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was not an isolated wake-up call. It was the logical, systemic outcome of an economic philosophy that viewed labor as an endless commodity. And when workers attempted to organize and demand basic humanity through strikes, they found themselves facing not just their immediate employers, but the full, terrifying apparatus of state violence. The struggle for human rights was not fought in quiet legislative chambers. It was forged in bloodshed across the streets, rail yards, and mining hollows of the nation. The battle lines had been drawn decades earlier during the rise of the Knights of Labor and the national push for an 8-hour workday. On May 4th, 1886, a peaceful rally was called at Haymarket Square in Chicago to protest police brutality against striking workers at a nearby farm equipment plant. As rain began to fall and the crowd was dispersing, a line of heavily armed police officers marched into the square, ordering the remaining demonstrators to leave. Out of the darkness, an unknown individual threw a dynamite bomb directly into the police ranks, killing 7 officers. Police instantly opened fire on the crowded square, killing 4 workers and wounding dozens more. In the hysteria that swept the nation, authority figures used the Haymarket Affair to brand all labor organizers as bloodthirsty anarchists, terrorists, and threats to civilization. 8 labor activists were convicted in a trial that historians now recognize as a complete mockery of justice, and 4 were executed by hanging. The momentum for an 8-hour day was crushed under a wave of anti-union panic. Less than a decade later, the pattern repeated itself with ruthless scale during the Pullman Strike of 1894. George Pullman, owner of the famous sleeper car company, had constructed a model company town south of Chicago. When a national economic panic hit, Pullman slashed his workers' wages by 25%. But in a display of breathtaking arrogance, he refused to lower the rents on the company houses or reduce the prices at the company store where his workers were forced to shop. Families were left with paychecks that amounted to pennies after rent was automatically deducted. When the workers walked out in protest, backed by the American Railway Union under the charismatic leadership of Eugene V. Debs, rail traffic across 27 states came to a grinding halt. The response from Washington was swift and brutal. President Grover Cleveland dispatched 12,000 federal troops to Chicago to break the strike, claiming the stoppage interfered with the delivery of the United States mail. In the clashes that followed, federal soldiers fired into crowds of striking workers, killing over 30 people, wounding hundreds, and arresting Debs. The Union was crushed, the strike was broken, and President Cleveland offered a single symbolic boon to the battered working class. He signed legislation establishing Labor Day as a federal holiday. It was a hollow, cynical gesture designed to pacify a nation that was witnessing its government function as the private enforcement wing of industrial monopolies. Even when state legislatures occasionally attempted to pass basic laws to protect workers, the judicial system stepped in to shield corporate interests. State after state tried to enact modest maximum hour restrictions or minimum wage recommendations for women and children, only to see them systematically dismantled by the courts. In the landmark 1905 case, Lochner versus New York, the Supreme Court struck down a law limiting bakery workers to 10 hours a day, declaring that such regulations violated the freedom of contract guaranteed by the Constitution. The legal reasoning was as brilliant in theory as it was grotesque in practice. The court argued that an individual, starving worker, and a massive industrial conglomerate had equal bargaining power, and that the government had no right to interfere if a worker freely chose to work 16 hours a day in a disease-ridden basement for pennies. In 1923, the court went even further in Adkins versus Children's Hospital, striking down a minimum wage law for women in the nation's capital. By the roaring 1920s, the message from the highest courts in the land was absolute and unwavering. The legal system viewed the freedom to exploit as a sacred right, while viewing the struggle for survival as an illegal conspiracy. Workers were isolated, exhausted, and abandoned by their government. The system seemed impenetrable, backed by private armies, federal troops, and Supreme Court rulings. But the unchecked greed that built this system was steering the American economy directly off a cliff, setting the stage for a catastrophic collapse that would finally force the nation to choose between structural reform and total social revolution. When the American stock market crashed in October of 1929, it did not merely wipe out corporate fortunes on Wall Street. It detonated the frail, unregulated foundation of the entire national economy. The Great Depression was not an unpredictable act of nature. It was the ultimate, inevitable consequence of an economic philosophy that had spent decades driving wages down to the bare bone while concentrating unimaginable wealth at the very top. By 1933, the machine had completely ground to a halt. Roughly 25% of the entire American workforce was unemployed, 1 out of every 4 breadwinners standing in endless soup lines, sleeping in cardboard shanty towns, and watching their children go hungry. For those fortunate enough to retain a job, the absence of a legal wage floor meant conditions deteriorated into sheer madness. Employers, facing collapsing demand, cut pay again and again. Garment workers who had previously earned $11 a week saw their wages slashed to $4. Factory laborers were forced to accept 12 cents an hour, fully aware that hundreds of desperate, starving men were waiting outside the factory gates, eager to replace them if they uttered a single word of protest. It was into this abyss of systemic failure that Franklin Delano Roosevelt assumed the presidency in March of 1933. Roosevelt understood a fundamental truth that his predecessors had stubbornly refused to see. The unbridled free market had not self-corrected, it had self-destructed. A society cannot function when its working population is systematically starved of the purchasing power required to buy the very goods they produce. Roosevelt set out to rebuild the nation's economic architecture through the New Deal, but his initial attempt to establish minimum wage standards through the National Industrial Recovery Act was struck down by an uncompromising Supreme Court in 1935. The High Court remained steadfast in its commitment to the Gilded Age doctrine of freedom of contract, leaving the president furious and millions of workers trapped in poverty. Yet Roosevelt was not fighting this battle alone. Standing directly beside him was Frances Perkins, the first woman ever to serve in a presidential cabinet as the Secretary of Labor. Perkins was not a career politician. She was a hardened social reformer who had personally witnessed the harrowing sight of young women jumping to their deaths from the burning upper floors of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in 1911. That haunting memory had forged her life's mission. When Roosevelt invited her to join his cabinet, Perkins accepted on one uncompromising condition: that the administration commit to passing a national minimum wage, a strict limit on working hours, and a total federal ban on child labor. For 5 grueling years, Perkins worked quietly and strategically in the background, consulting top legal minds to draft a bill capable of surviving the relentless hostility of the Supreme Court. She kept 2 distinct drafts locked in the bottom drawer of her desk, patiently waiting for the precise political moment to strike. That moment arrived in 1937, following a fierce constitutional crisis. Faced with Roosevelt's threat to expand the size of the court, the Supreme Court underwent a historic shift, often referred to as the switch in time that saved 9, and finally began upholding key New Deal legislation. Perkins seized the opportunity, pulled her draft bills from her desk drawer, and unleashed the historic battle for the Fair Labor Standards Act. The political warfare that followed was ruthless. Powerful business lobbying groups, including the National Association of Manufacturers, launched massive campaigns claiming that a federal minimum wage would cripple industry, destroy jobs, and plunge the nation into economic ruin. Southern politicians fought bitterly against the bill, fearing that a uniform wage floor would dismantle the Southern economic model, which relied heavily on hyper-cheap labor and the systemic financial suppression of black workers. To secure the votes necessary to pass the law, a painful, tragic political compromise was struck. The final version of the bill deliberately excluded agricultural laborers and domestic workers from its protections, 2 massive categories of employment that were overwhelmingly occupied by black, Latino, and poor white workers, particularly in the South. It was a carving out of human rights that left millions of the nation's most vulnerable citizens unprotected, a structural sacrifice that would echo through decades of racial and economic inequality. Yet despite these deeply flawed concessions, the passage of the law represented a monumental watershed moment in human history. On June 25, 1938, President Roosevelt signed the Fair Labor Standards Act into law. The act established a federal minimum wage of 25 cents per hour, created a mandatory 44-hour work week with required overtime pay beyond that threshold, and finally outlawed oppressive child labor across the United States. 25 cents an hour, roughly equivalent to about $5.40 in today's currency, was a modest sum, but its significance was profound. For the first time in the history of the American Republic, the federal government drew an unyielding line in the sand. It declared to every corporate entity in the land that human labor was no longer a disposable commodity, and that an employer's right to turn a profit ended where a worker's right to basic human dignity began. The Fair Labor Standards Act also dealt a fatal blow to the predatory company store system. The law explicitly mandated that workers in covered industries had to be paid in legal United States currency, officially outlawing the private scrip, metal tokens, and paper slips that had trapped generations of coal miners and lumber workers in permanent financial bondage. It took 162 years from the signing of the Declaration of Independence, decades of violent labor strikes, the sacrifice of young lives in burning sweatshops and dark coal shafts, a devastating Great Depression, and a constitutional showdown with the Supreme Court to establish the radical idea that a human being deserves a guaranteed floor beneath their labor. The creation of the minimum wage was never merely a technical adjustment of economic policy. It was a fundamental redefinition of the social contract between a democratic government and its people. Prior to 1938, the legal framework of the nation protected the absolute right of the powerful to exploit the weak under the guise of free enterprise. The Fair Labor Standards Act shattered that doctrine, establishing the precedent that a civilized society has a moral duty to set boundaries on greed. In a famous fireside chat defending the legislation, President Roosevelt directly addressed the corporate critics who claimed they could not afford to pay a minimum wage, stating plainly that no business which depends for its existence on paying less than living wages to its workers has any right to continue in this country. Today, as modern debates surrounding wage stagnation, inflation, and corporate power continue to dominate the political landscape, the history of 1938 serves as a vital reminder. The weekends you enjoy, the 40-hour work week, the absence of young children operating factory machinery, and the guaranteed minimum wage were not gifts granted by corporate benevolence or the natural benevolence of an unregulated market. They were hard-won, fragile protections purchased through the sweat, blood, and relentless struggle of generations who demanded that human lives be valued above corporate margins. Understanding how American workers were paid before 1938 is not just a lesson in history. It is an enduring reminder of what it costs to demand dignity in a world that so often treats human beings as disposable parts in a machine.